Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 7-game slate for college basketball. Let me go ahead and give you my winners for each game. I have Texas A&M winning, South Carolina winning, we have Vanderbilt winning, Rutgers winning, Wisconsin winning, Washington winning, and then UCLA over Washington State. So those are my picks for these games. Most of these games look like they're going to be relatively lopsided. I think there's only two games that are even within 5 or 6 points. Actually, I think there's only one, and that's the Washington USC game. Pretty much everybody else is at least 10 points or more, as far as I can tell here. That's what it looks like. So, with that said, let's get into the players I do like today. We're going to start with our guards, and we're going to start with Sam Session. Sessions. Oh shoot, I hit the thing here. Sorry, Sessions for Coppin State. Now his team isn't expected to win this game. They're expected to get blown out, but he's a pretty decent value play. He's only had one game all season under 29 fantasy points, and even though the matchup isn't ideal, he's very cheap for his potential. He's going to get a lot of shot attempts and stuff like that, and he's going to get plenty of minutes, regardless of how the game goes. And he's probably the one guy on Coppin State that can break through and have a big game regardless. He hasn't played a lot of like top tier teams or anything this season, but he's had a couple games and against decent okay teams, and he's done well in those games for the most part. And even if he gets 20 or so fantasy points, he still pays off here. So I expect him to play well in this game regardless. He's also averaging 1 fantasy point per game. Then we're going to look at Paul Malaki for Rutgers. Now his team is expected to win by I think 25 or so points. So the only risk here is his minutes, but he got hurt in Game 3 this season, but he's now back and starting playing 30-plus minutes a game. And in full games, his lowest scoring game is around 24 fantasy points. He should score in the mid-20s today, and his price point is pretty reasonable for that potential. He's averaging about .76 fantasy points per game as well this season. Then we're going to look at Michi Johnson Jr. for South Carolina. Now he is $6,700, about the same price as Malaki is, and he's had 5 straight games over 24 fantasy points, and he's become a leading player for South Carolina. He's also averaging .83 fantasy points per game, so he's right in line with Malaki on his potential, and he has very similar price point, and I don't feel like you go wrong with either one. Then we'll look at Caleb McConnell here. Now Caleb McConnell for Rutgers. He's $7,200. He's a little bit more expensive than some of the guys. He started the last 6 after missing the first 5 games of the season, and he's had one game under 17 fantasy points before that. He has 30 fantasy point upside, which is nice. His price is a little bit higher than the previous 2 guys, but he also has a little bit more upside than those guys do, and he has some good opportunity here in a plus matchup. Obviously, blowout potential is a little bit of a risk here, but overall, he's pretty decent. He's also averaging .78 fantasy points a game. And I have 2 value plays here at this position. First, we're going to look at Reese Dixon Waters for USC. He's at $4,900. He's not a starter, but he's still getting a starter-like minutes, and he has no games under 10 fantasy points since game 1. Obviously, he's a little bit up and down, but especially on the minutes perspective. But he's been playing well enough, and his price point is reasonable. He's not somebody that I would expect to get 35, 40 fantasy points in this matchup because it is a tough matchup for his team. But he should play plenty of minutes and have plenty of opportunity to score 15 to 25 fantasy points. I think in this game is definitely doable for him. And then also PJ Fuller for Washington. Now he's an interesting spot here. At his price point, it's been fluctuating all season long, just like his scoring has. But he's had no games under 12 fantasy points all season long, and he's playing around 25 minutes a game, and he's a starter, so I think he's in a pretty good spot here. He's also averaging .68 fantasy points per minute, so he definitely has some upside. But it is a little bit capped, but he is playing, consistent and scoring good amount of fantasy points. So I think he's a viable, cheap option to help you pay for some cheap guys. Then we're going to get forwards, and I've got a few guys here. Cliff Amarari is my top guy for Rutgers. He's averaging a ridiculous 1.14 fantasy points per minute, and he's been over 20 fantasy points every single game this year, and he has 50 fantasy point upside. He's got a really good matchup here. The only real risk here, again, is the fact that this game could be a blowout. But even in blowouts, he's been having 25 to 30 fantasy points for the most part. And I expect that to continue in this particular game as well. Then we're going to look at G.G. Jackson for South Carolina. And now he's $7,800, a little bit cheaper. His lowest scoring game is 23 fantasy points on the season, but he kind of is consistent in the fact that he doesn't have a tremendous amount of upside. He averages 0.91 fantasy points per game, which is a little bit lower for a forward than I typically like, but he's not a huge rebound guy. But he does, and he is kind of scoring dependent. He does have some games with some big rebound numbers, but he is probably going to get somewhere in the 25 35 point range. That's the range I expect for him. I don't really see him as a guy that's going to have 40 to 50 fantasy point upside, but he's got a good matchup here. Obviously, they are projected to win the game by over 10 points, but he's got some viability in this matchup, and his price point is reasonable enough. And then finally, Leon Robbins for Vanderbilt. He's probably the most expensive guy that I would consider today at $8,100. He doesn't start every game either, which is a little bit of a concern, and obviously the minutes, in a blowout are concerned. But he has not scored under 20 fantasy points in a game since the second game of the year, and his minutes could be risky as a result of the potential of blowout. But he's also averaging a 1.24 fantasy point per game, and it just makes him very viable on the slate. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.